What would you do if the only thing you had left in the world was a piece of paper everyone told you was worthless? Imagine being handed a faded, hand-drawn map, a parting gift of pure mockery from the very people who took everything else. They believe it leads to nothing but rock and ruin, a final, bitter joke at your expense. But the truth, waiting in those penciled lines, a secret buried under years of dust and neglect, was a legacy more valuable than all the land they fought to keep. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this is the story of a forgotten map, a determined woman, and the home she built from the ashes of betrayal. Emma Whitcomb stood on the porch of the only home she had known for 5 years and watched the Wyoming sky bruise purple at the edges. The wind, a constant thief in this high country, stole the warmth from her thin shawl and whipped a strand of brown hair across her face. Behind her, in the warm light of the ranch house, her brother-in-law, Caleb, cleared his throat. He was a man made of hard angles and harder opinions. "It's done then," he said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a nail being driven into a coffin lid. Her husband Thomas's coffin had been lowered into the hard ground just 2 days prior. The ground, like the family, had not wanted to yield. Her belongings were a small, sad pile at her feet. A bedroll, a sack containing a half measure of flour and some dried jerky, and the worn dress she stood in. Caleb's wife, Martha, had made it clear that the other dresses, the furniture, the very memories inside the house, now belonged to them. They were Whitcomb things, and since Thomas was gone, Emma was no longer a Whitcomb. She was just a woman from back east who had the misfortune of being widowed on the wrong side of the mountains. Caleb shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning in protest. He held out a folded piece of foolscap, yellowed and creased. "Thomas was always drawing this nonsense," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Said it was a map to his special place, probably just some rock he liked to sit on." He pushed it into her hand. "Take it. A final piece of your husband's foolishness to remember him by." Emma's fingers closed around the paper. She remembered the nights Thomas had worked on it by lantern light, his brow furrowed in concentration, the smell of graphite and focus filling their small room. He'd called it his inheritance, a secret only the land knew. She had thought it a game, a husband's gentle fantasy. Now it was all she had of him. She unfolded it. A series of crude lines depicted the rise of the foothills, a winding creek, and a cluster of symbols near a formation of rocks that looked like a sleeping giant. In the corner, in Thomas's careful hand, were the words, "Where the water sleeps." "It's nothing," Caleb said, seeing the hope flicker in her eyes and feeling the need to extinguish it. "There's an old line shack up there, maybe, rotted through. On Mercer's grazing land, anyway. He'll run you off soon as he sees you." He turned to go back inside, the conversation over. "Good luck to you, Emma." The door clicked shut, a sound as final as a judge's gavel. Emma stood there until the last of the light bled from the sky, leaving only a smear of stars. The wind howled, a lonely and indifferent sound. She looked from the warm, closed-off light of the ranch house to the dark, rising silhouette of the foothills. One was a past that had cast her out. The other was a future drawn in pencil on a worthless piece of paper. She tied the flour sack to her bedroll, tucked the map safely into a pocket, and began to walk toward the sleeping giant, one slow, deliberate step at a time. The weight on her back was slight, but the weight in her heart was a thing of stone. The journey was a pilgrimage of dust and silence. For 2 days, Emma Whitcomb walked, following the faint cattle trails that led from the wide, grassy valley into the wrinkled foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. The sun was a hammer, the nights a blanket of chilling cold. She ate the jerky sparingly, her thoughts a constant, quiet conversation with the husband she had lost. She remembered Thomas's hands, calloused from work but gentle in their touch, tracing the very lines on the map she now consulted at every turn. He hadn't been a foolish man. He had been a quiet one, a man who listened more to the land than to the loud talk of his brother. Caleb saw value in acreage and herds. Thomas, she was beginning to understand, had seen value in secrets. By the third morning, her feet were blistered and her hope was worn as thin as her boot soles. The landmarks on the map, a lightning-scarred pine, a dry creek bed that snaked like a reptile's spine, had led her deep into a country that felt older and less forgiving than any place she had ever known. And then she saw it. Tucked into a small, wind-scoured bowl below a ridge that did indeed look like the profile of a sleeping giant, was a shack. It was less a building and more a suggestion of one, its roof slumped like a tired man's shoulders, its walls the color of bone. A thin curl of smoke, pale as a ghost, rose from its stone chimney. It wasn't abandoned. A man was splitting wood beside the cabin, the rhythmic thump of his axe the only sound in the vast emptiness. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and suspenders, his face shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. He stopped his work as she approached, resting the axe head on the chopping block. His posture was wary, his eyes narrowed against the glare. He had the look of a man who had been alone for a long time and preferred it that way. "This is private land," he said, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It was not a question. "I'm looking for a place," Emma said, her own voice feeling small against the backdrop of the mountains. "My husband, he drew a map." She hesitated, then pulled the folded paper from her pocket. The man didn't move to take it. He glanced at it, then back at her face. "That's Mercer land. I'm Mercer, William Mercer." He looked her over, taking in the worn dress, the dust on her cheeks, the exhaustion in her eyes. "You're one of the Whitcombs." Another statement, not a question. News, even bad news, traveled fast between the isolated ranches. "I was," she replied quietly. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping from her to the dilapidated shack and back again. He saw the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. He also saw the grit that had carried her this far. "This shack ain't fit for winter," he said finally. "Roof leaks. Walls are full of holes. Wind comes through like a train." He paused, looking at the pile of unsplit logs. But a second pair of hands could make a difference. He laid out the terms with the stark efficiency of a man who didn't waste words. She could stay through the winter. Her payment would be labor. They would repair the shack together. Come spring, she would move on. There was no kindness in the offer, only a hard, practical logic. He needed help. She needed shelter. It was a transaction. "I'm a hard worker," Emma promised, the words rushing out in a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. William Mercer just nodded, picking up his axe. "Wood needs stacking before dusk," he said, and turned back to his work. Emma stood for a moment, the map still clutched in her hand. This was it. The place Thomas had drawn. A derelict cabin and a wary stranger on a piece of land that wasn't hers. It felt like the punchline to Caleb's cruel joke. But as the axe fell again, ringing with the clear, sharp sound of purpose, she felt something else too. A beginning. Was this weary rancher offering a lifeline or just delaying the inevitable? What secret did Thomas Whitcomb truly believe was hidden in this forgotten corner of the world? And could it possibly be worth more than the dirt it was buried in? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of frontier justice and hidden legacies. Now, let's get back to the story, because the first whispers of winter were already on the wind. A week later, William Mercer announced he was riding to Redemption for supplies. The small settlement was little more than a general store, a blacksmith, and a saloon, huddled by a creek crossing 2 days' ride away. He didn't invite her to come, but he didn't forbid it either. "Wagons leaving at dawn," was all he said. Emma knew this was her one chance to buy what she couldn't make or find: salt, coffee, perhaps some warmer thread for mending. She packed the few coins she had sewn into the hem of her dress and was waiting by the wagon when the first pale light touched the peaks. The ride was conducted in near total silence, the rattle of the wagon wheels and the snort of the horses filling the space between them. Redemption was a shock of noise, and people after the profound quiet of the foothills. Men in dusty hats watched her from the porch of the saloon, their eyes lingering. Women leaving the general store paused to whisper behind their hands. She was an anomaly, a lone woman, clearly in mourning, arriving with a man as famously solitary as William Mercer. As she stepped down from the wagon, a familiar voice cut through the murmuring. "Well, look what the wind blew in." Caleb Whitcomb stood there, leaning against a hitching post, a smug smile on his face. He had clearly ridden in from the main ranch. "I see you found Mercer's ruin. Didn't take you long to find another man to take care of you, Emma." His words were loud, meant for the audience of onlookers. Emma's face burned with shame, but she lifted her chin, her gaze steady. "I am taking care of myself, Caleb." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "With what? That fool map? I hear you're patching up that old shack. Polishing a turd is what that is. You'll be begging for a meal at my door before the first snow sticks." He looked past her to William, who was unloading a barrel. "You're a fool, Mercer, for taking in strays." William didn't even look up. "My business," he said, his voice flat and final. As Caleb swaggered toward the saloon, convinced he had won the exchange, an old woman sitting on a bench outside the general store caught Emma's eye. She was native, her face a beautiful road map of wrinkles, her black eyes holding a deep, ancient calm. She had been watching the entire scene, her expression unreadable. As Emma passed, the woman put out a hand, her fingers surprisingly strong, and touched the pocket where the map was tucked. "Some lines show where you have been," the old woman said, her voice soft but clear as a bell. "Others show where the earth keeps its promises." She looked toward the mountains, a flicker of something knowing in her gaze. "The lines that look like rivers are roots. The roots hold the oldest water." The words were strange, cryptic. Emma murmured a thank you, confused, and hurried into the store, the woman's piercing gaze feeling like it was imprinted on her back. She bought her salt and thread, her mind churning. The roots hold the oldest water. It sounded like the kind of poetry Thomas had sometimes spoken, phrases that made little sense at the time but lingered in the memory. As she and William rode out of Redemption, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind, the old woman's words echoed louder than Caleb's mockery. She pulled out the map, studying the winding creek. It wasn't a creek. Thomas had drawn it with feathered, branching lines, more like a tree's root system than a waterway. A new kind of chill, one that had nothing to do with the coming winter, settled over her. The first heavy snow came 2 weeks later, a thick, wet fall that sealed the high country in a blanket of white. It found Emma and William in a state of shared, frantic labor. Their days had fallen into a rhythm dictated by necessity. From dawn until dusk, they worked on the shack. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was a comfortable, well-worn thing, broken only by essential questions and observations. "Hand me the hammer. This beam is rotted through. Another storm's coming from the north." Emma had never worked so hard in her life. She learned to mix mud and grass into chinking to seal the gaps between the logs, her hands becoming raw and chapped. She helped William stretch a new piece of canvas over the hole in the roof, her arms aching from holding it taut against the wind. She learned the smell of pine sawdust, the heft of an axe, the particular weariness that comes from a day spent fighting against decay. The shack, under their combined efforts, began to transform. It was still a small, rough place, but the wind no longer screamed through the walls, and the roof held against the rain. It was becoming defensible. Their arrival back from redemption had marked a subtle shift. William had seen Caleb's cruelty firsthand, and though he said nothing, he seemed to look at Emma with a new, grudging respect. He had seen her stand her ground without flinching. One evening, as they sat by the fire, mending tools in the flickering light, he spoke without preamble. "My wife, Sarah, she died of a fever 2 years back," he said, his eyes fixed on the piece of leather he was stitching. "This was supposed to be our place. We were going to build a proper house right here. Said the valley ranches were getting too crowded." He fell silent, the memory hanging in the air between them. Emma, patching a tear in her dress, simply nodded. "Thomas talked about this place the same way," she offered quietly. "He said it was quiet enough to hear the world breathe. It was the most they had ever shared, an exchange of ghosts, a quiet acknowledgement of the losses that had driven them both to this isolated scrap of land. The shack was no longer just his or hers. It was a shelter for their shared griefs. After the first big snow, they were truly cut off. The world shrank to the walls of the cabin, the small, cleared path to the woodpile, and the vast, silent expanse of white. Emma would often stand in the doorway, looking out at the landscape, now softened and simplified by the snow. She'd pull out the map, comparing its lines to the visible ridges. Caleb had called it foolishness, but the more time she spent here, the more she felt its strange accuracy. The sleeping giant ridge was a perfect match. The stand of 3 ancient pines on the northern hill was exactly where Thomas had drawn it. One afternoon, while sweeping the packed dirt floor near the hearth, her broom caught on a loose flagstone. It was a nuisance she'd noted before, but this time, preoccupied with the memory of the old woman's words, she stopped. She knelt down, running her fingers along its edge. It was shaped differently from the others, less jagged, almost purposefully cut. She pulled out the map. In the drawing of the shack's interior, a detail she'd previously overlooked, one stone by the hearth was marked with a tiny, almost invisible star. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She looked over at William, who was outside, clearing snow from the animal lean-to. This was a secret from the map. It was Thomas's secret. She felt a tremor of something electric, a connection to her husband across the veil of death. The stone refused to budge. It was heavy, settled deep into the earth. But the clue was there, a single, stubborn detail that refused to fit the narrative of a worthless, forgotten place. The map was not just a drawing of the land. It was an instruction manual. And she was standing on the first step. The discovery of the marked stone shifted something in Emma. It was no longer enough to simply survive the winter. A deeper current of purpose now pulled at her. She didn't tell William about it at first. The secret felt too fragile, too intimately tied to Thomas. For days she lived with the knowledge, her eyes constantly drawn to the hearth, her mind racing. The map was a puzzle, and she had just found the corner piece. But how to proceed? She couldn't lift the stone on her own, and to ask for William's help would be to invite questions she wasn't ready to answer, to risk a skepticism that might shatter her fragile hope. So she turned her attention outward, to the other clues. The map showed the River of Roots, originating from a point behind the shack, in a shallow depression where a thicket of stubborn, snow-dusted aspens grew. One afternoon, driven by a restless energy, she took a shovel and began to clear the snow from that area. William watched her from the woodpile, his expression unreadable. "Ground's frozen solid," he stated, his voice flat. "Whatever you're looking for, it can wait for the thaw." "Just stretching my legs," she called back, her breath pluming in the frigid air. But she wasn't just digging randomly. She was observing. She noticed that the snow in the very center of the aspen grove was shallower than the surrounding drifts, as if some faint, residual warmth from the earth below were melting it from beneath. And she remembered something else. The coyotes. Their tracks often led to this thicket. They didn't shelter there. They seemed to be drawn to that one spot, sniffing at the ground before moving on. An animal's odd behavior. Another clue clicked into place. Her quiet investigation became part of their daily rhythm. While William hunted or tended to the horses, Emma would walk the land, map in hand, learning its contours, its secrets. The labor of their shared survival continued, a constant backdrop to her search. They raised a small, sturdy fence for the horses, using timber William had felled before she arrived. They insulated the last of the walls with a mixture of dried moss and mud she gathered from the banks of the half-frozen creek. Through this shared work, their unspoken partnership deepened. He began to show her things: how to read the clouds for an approaching storm, how to track a rabbit in the snow, how to bank the fire so it would last through the night. In return, she brought a sense of order to the cabin's chaotic interior, organizing their meager supplies, mending his worn clothes, making the small space feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a bastion against the wilderness. One evening, a week after her discovery of the shallow snow, a thaw set in. A warm Chinook wind swept down from the mountains, and for 2 days, the snow receded, exposing patches of damp, brown earth. It was now or never. That night, by the fire, she finally spoke. "The flagstone by the hearth," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's loose, and it's marked on my husband's map." William stopped sharpening his knife and looked at her, his gaze intense. He didn't mock her. He had seen her dedication, her quiet certainty. He had seen how the map's landmarks had proven true time and again. He rose without a word, fetched a long iron pry bar from the corner, and walked to the hearth. He wedged the tip of the bar into the seam. "Stand back," he said. He put his weight into it, his muscles straining. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan of protest, the stone shifted, scraping against its neighbors. Together, they worked their fingers under the edge and lifted. It was heavy, thick, and damp on its underside. Beneath it was not a hidden cache of gold or a hollowed-out space, but something far more mundane and far more mysterious. Another map? This one carved into a second, larger stone tablet set deeper in the earth. It was a more detailed version of the paper map, But this one showed a complex network of channels leading from the aspen thicket directly to the foundation of the shack. It showed a system. William stared at the carving, his skepticism finally giving way to a raw, stunned curiosity. "What in God's name did your husband find out here?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. Emma looked from the stone map at their feet to the aspen grove outside, its bare branches stark against the evening sky. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. The roots hold the oldest water. "I think," she said, her voice filled with a dawning awe, "he found the source." The discovery of the stone map galvanized them. The project was no longer Emma's solitary quest. It became a shared obsession. The next morning, armed with shovels, picks, and the iron pry bar, they went to the aspen grove. The ground, softened by the Chinook, yielded to their efforts. William, with his lean strength, broke through the frozen topsoil, while Emma cleared away the loosened dirt and rock. They worked in tandem, a silent, efficient team fueled by the same unspoken question. As they dug deeper, the earth grew darker and damper. A clean, mineral scent, the smell of deep earth water, rose to meet them. About 4 feet down, William's shovel struck something hard and flat with a dull thunk. It wasn't a boulder. The sound was too uniform. Carefully, they cleared the dirt around it, their hands scrabbling in the cold mud. They uncovered the edge of a massive cut slab of sandstone, and then another and another, laid together with a precision that bespoke immense effort and skill. They had found a roof, buried beneath the earth. It took them the rest of the day to clear the slabs and find the entrance. It was a low, stone-lined doorway, sealed with a single, perfectly fitted stone plug. Using the pry bar and their combined strength, they worked it loose. A rush of cool, clean air, smelling of stone and water, washed over them. William lit a lantern, the flame casting flickering shadows, and crouched down to peer inside. Emma was right behind him. The lantern light revealed a small, vaulted chamber, walled and floored with masterfully cut stone. It was not a root cellar or a mine. It was a spring house. In the center of the floor, a pool of water, clear as glass, bubbled up from a source deep within the earth, filling a basin carved from a single piece of rock. The water was in constant, gentle motion, flowing into a covered stone channel that led off in the direction of the shack, the very channel depicted on the stone map beneath their hearth. It was an engineering marvel, hidden and perfectly preserved. "This water, it never freezes," William whispered, his voice filled with reverence. He touched the surface. It was cool, but not icy. This was the reason the snow melted faster here. This was what the animals knew. But there was more. As Emma's eyes adjusted to the light, she saw a small niche carved into the far wall, just above the waterline. Tucked inside was a tin box, the kind used for keeping tea or biscuits. It was heavy for its size and sealed with a thick layer of hardened wax. They brought the box back to the cabin, placing it on the rough-hewn table between them. The air was thick with anticipation. William carefully broke the wax seal with his knife and pried open the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried leaves, were 3 objects. The first was a small leather-bound ledger. The second was a collection of cloth packets containing seeds, each labeled with a careful, elegant script. The third was a folded document, tied with a leather cord. Emma reached for the ledger, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it. The first page contained a name and a date: Sparrow's Wing, 1845. The script was the same as on the seed packets. It was a journal, detailing the construction of the spring house, the planting of a garden, the flow of the water. It was a record of a life lived on this land, decades before the Whitcombs or the Mercers had ever seen it. William gently untied the leather cord and unfolded the document. It was a legal deed, penned by a traveling magistrate from Fort Laramie. It granted title of the 100 acres surrounding the spring, in perpetuity, to one Sparrow's Wing, a woman of the Shoshone people, in gratitude for saving the life of a trapper named Jean-Pierre Renaud. The deed was stamped, signed, and witnessed. It was ironclad. This land wasn't Mercer's grazing allotment. It had never been part of the Whitcomb Ranch. It belonged to a ghost. Thomas hadn't just found a spring. He had found a history, a legacy. He had uncovered a truth that changed everything. The weight of the discovery settled over the small cabin, profound and silencing. The deed lay on the table between them, a testament to a forgotten history and a claim far older and more legitimate than any of their own. For hours, they sat in silence, the lantern light guttering, each lost in their own thoughts. The spring house wasn't just a source of water, it was a monument. The land wasn't a barren plot to be owned, but a trust they had stumbled upon. Emma finally understood. Thomas hadn't been drawing a map to a place, but to a story that was now theirs to protect. That night, the weather turned. The brief respite of the Chinook was devoured by a gathering storm that swept down from the north with astonishing speed. The wind began to moan around the eaves of the cabin, a low, mournful sound that grew into a piercing shriek. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding horizontal torrent that erased the world outside their windows. It was a true blizzard, the kind old-timers spoke of with a mixture of fear and respect. Inside, the cabin felt like the eye of the storm. The fire roared in the hearth, their repairs held fast against the wind's assault, and the air was filled with a strange, suspended peace. The deed and the ledger lay on the table, a silent testament to their new reality. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof for survival. They were custodians of a secret. "She writes about the garden," Emma said softly, breaking the long silence. She had been poring over Sparrow's Wing's ledger. She grew corn, squash, beans. She says the spring water meant she never had to worry about drought. She called this place the land that gives back. William nodded, his gaze distant. "My father used to say this patch of ground was worthless, too rocky for grazing, too high for farming." He looked at the ledger, at the proof of a life that had thrived here. He was wrong. The storm raged for 2 full days, imprisoning them in the small circle of their lantern light. They rationed their wood and food, the world outside a churning chaos of white. It was during this forced intimacy that the last of the walls between them finally crumbled. They talked for hours, sharing stories of the lives they had lived before loss had pared them down to their essential selves. He spoke of Sarah's laughter, and she spoke of Thomas's quiet kindness. They were no longer just archetypes, the widow, the widower, but two people finding solace in a shared shelter. On the third morning, the wind died down, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a deep, pristine silence. As the first light broke, they heard a faint sound from the east, a desperate, muffled shouting. William grabbed his rifle, his face grim. Trouble in this weather was deadly trouble. They found them less than a half-mile from the cabin, a family of German immigrants, a man, a pregnant woman, and a small boy. Their wagon hopelessly mired in a snowdrift, one wheel splintered. They were half frozen, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. The man, whose name was Heinrich, explained in broken English that they had been trying to reach a relative's homestead, before the storm hit and had lost the trail. Without a word, William and Emma led them back to the shack. Emma wrapped the shivering woman and child in every blanket they had, placing them by the fire and giving them warm broth. William and Heinrich, using the horses, managed to unhitch the oxen and lead them to the lean-to for shelter. For the next week, the tiny cabin became a crowded, noisy sanctuary. The boy, Otto, quickly recovered his spirits, his laughter filling the small space. His mother, Elspeth, watched Emma with wide, grateful eyes. They shared their food, their water, their warmth, stretching their meager supplies to accommodate their unexpected guests. It was in this act of selfless giving that Emma saw the true meaning of what they had found. The spring house wasn't a treasure to be hoarded. It was a resource to be shared. The land that gives back. She was living Sparrow's Wings' legacy. This was the test. It wasn't about ownership or legal claims. It was about choosing to build a haven in the middle of a harsh and unforgiving world. As soon as the snow had hardened enough to travel, Heinrich, profoundly grateful, promised to send word from Redemption. Before he left, he stood at the door, his hat in his hands. "You have a good place here," he said, his gaze taking in the solid cabin and the clear, constant trickle of water from the pipe William had rigged from the spring. A place of life. Just as Heinrich's family was preparing to depart, another rider appeared, silhouetted against the bright snow. It was Caleb Whitcomb. He reined in his horse, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The repaired cabin, the smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney, the strangers preparing to leave. Suspicion and anger radiated from him. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Running a hotel now, Mercer?" He looked at Emma, a sneer twisting his lips. "Still playing homesteader on land that isn't yours?" Before Emma could speak, William stepped forward, positioning himself between her and Caleb. He was calm, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "This land was never yours to give away, Caleb," William said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "And it was never mine to claim." He held out the deed. "You should read this, carefully." The departure of Heinrich's family was like a stone tossed into a still pond, sending ripples out across the high country. They reached Redemption not just with a story of survival, but with a tale of near miraculous sanctuary. They spoke of a hidden spring of sweet, ever-flowing water, a warm cabin, and the quiet, capable couple who had taken them in without a moment's hesitation. The story flew from the saloon to the general store, from the blacksmith to the stables. The whispers that had once followed Emma were replaced by a new chorus of curiosity and respect. A week later, a man on a fine-looking horse rode up to the shack. He was older, with a neat gray beard and spectacles, and he introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a circuit lawyer and land agent out of Cheyenne. He had heard the story from Heinrich, and, his professional interest piqued, had come to see the deed for himself. William and Emma invited him in. They laid the deed and Sparrow's Wings ledger on the table. Mr. Abernathy spent over an hour examining them, his brow furrowed in concentration. He held the deed up to the light, studied the seals, and read every word of the ledger with meticulous care. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the rustle of paper and the crackle of the fire. Finally, he looked up, his expression one of quiet astonishment. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice hushed with something akin to reverence. "The deed is impeccably legal. The signatures are authentic. I recognize Magistrate Thorne's hand from other territorial documents of the period. And this ledger, This is a historical record of profound significance. He looked from Emma to William. This land, this 100 acres and its water rights, are not public domain. They are a private holding, legally deeded. He explained the legal standing. The land belonged to the descendants of Sparrow's Wing. If no descendants could be found after a thorough search, the deed stipulated the land was to be held in a territorial trust, managed for the public good, to preserve the water source. It can never be sold or absorbed into a neighboring ranch, he concluded, looking pointedly in the direction of the Whitcomb property. Its status is unique and protected. The news of Mr. Abernathy's verdict solidified Emma's and William's new standing in the community. Caleb Whitcomb, when presented with the lawyer's findings, had no choice but to retreat. He was humbled not by a show of force, but by the quiet, irrefutable power of the truth. His greed had been checked by a piece of paper he'd never known existed, a legacy written by a woman whose name he would never have learned. He was seen in Redemption a few weeks later, buying a round at the saloon, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a sullen quiet. As spring finally arrived, melting the last of the snow and turning the foothills a vibrant green, people began to arrive. Not in a rush, but in a slow, steady trickle. A family whose well had gone dry came to fill their barrels. A group of Shoshone riders, having heard the story through their own channels, came to see the home of their ancestor, standing by the spring house in silent, prayerful tribute. They thanked Emma and William for honoring her memory. The townspeople who had once mocked Emma now greeted her with nods of respect. She and William were no longer outcasts. They were the keepers of the spring, stewards of Sparrow's Wing's gift. The community, once a source of judgment, now looked to them as the quiet, steady heart of the foothills. The sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new pine growth. Emma stood beside the spring house, a bucket of clear, cold water in her hand. The land around them was alive. The seeds from Sparrow's Wing's packets, planted in a small, tilled garden plot, had begun to sprout, their green shoots pushing determinedly toward the sky. The trickle of water from the spring was the land's quiet heartbeat. William came and stood beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. They watched the last of the sun's fire catch on the highest peaks. In the months since the blizzard, a new rhythm had settled over their lives. They managed the spring, helped the travelers who came seeking water, and worked the small garden. Mr. Abernathy had begun the official search for Sparrow's Wing's descendants, a process he said could take years. Until then, he had appointed them official caretakers of the trust. They were, for the first time, exactly where they were supposed to be. The shack had become a home. Emma's touch was everywhere, in the clean-swept floors, the neatly stacked shelves, the wildflowers in a tin can on the table. William's quiet strength was in the solid roof, the sturdy fence, the constant, reassuring presence of a full woodpile. The ghosts of their pasts had not vanished, but they no longer haunted the small rooms. They had become gentle memories, integrated into the foundation of a new life. "It's beautiful," Emma said softly. Looking out at the wash of color over the mountains, William nodded, his gaze not on the sunset, but on her. "What will you do?" he asked, his voice low, "when they find her family?" It was the question that had hung unspoken between them for months. Emma looked at the small, sturdy cabin, its windows glowing with the warm light of the lantern she had lit inside. She looked at the fresh, green shoots in the garden, a promise of life to come. She looked at William, his weathered face softened by the twilight, the wariness in his eyes long since replaced by a deep and steady affection. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the grief, the cruelty, the dust and exhaustion. She thought of the worthless piece of paper that had been her only guide. "Thomas left me a map to a place," she said, her voice clear and sure in the quiet air. "I think we found a way to build a home." He reached out and took her free hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was an answer and a promise. The home was not the land, or the cabin, or the water. It was this. Together, they turned and walked back toward the light. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet strength and unexpected inheritance. If you were moved by the journey of finding home in the most unlikely of places, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the frontier. Let us know in the comments what a map to your special place might look like. We'll see you again soon. What would you do if your only inheritance was a map to a place that didn't exist, marking a single, locked building in the middle of nowhere? For 19-year-old Tessa Marigold Vance, this wasn't a riddle. It was the sum total of her grandfather's estate, a folded, brittle piece of paper pointing to a single spot in the barren expanse of the Arizona Territory, a place the locals called Ghost Mesa. The deed was for 1 square acre, purchased for $1, and on it, her grandfather had built something no one could explain. But the truth waiting inside that lonely stone structure was more valuable than any gold mine and would rewrite the future of life in the desert. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we tell the story of a girl, a map, and the secret of the stone cell. Tessa stepped down from the stagecoach, the dust of 3 states clinging to her black mourning dress. The town of Ghost Mesa wasn't much more than a single dusty street squinting under a punishing sun. A few clapboard buildings listed to one side, their paint peeled away to the bone-gray wood beneath. It was a place that felt forgotten by God and man, a fitting end to a journey that had begun with loss. Her grandfather, Elias Vance, had been a man of quiet obsessions, a cartographer and amateur geologist who spoke more to rocks and stars than he ever did to people. When he passed, the lawyer in dusty Tucson had looked at her with pity. There was no money, no house to speak of, just the satchel at her feet, containing a change of clothes, a worn book of poetry, and the map. She remembered the lawyer's dismissive tone. "Your grandfather owned 1 acre, Miss Vance, out in the Cinder Flats. He filed a patent for some kind of structure on it. Frankly, it's worthless. The land is alkali, the patent nonsensical. My advice is to sell the paper to a collector and find work here in the city." But Tessa had seen the look in her grandfather's eyes when he spoke of his project. It wasn't the wild gleam of a madman. It was the steady, focused light of a man who had found his life's purpose. To abandon it felt like a second burial. So she had taken the last of her savings and bought a one-way ticket to the closest settlement, Ghost Mesa. The air smelled of hot sand, horse manure, and the faint, bitter scent of creosote. Men leaning against the porch posts of the saloon stopped their whittling to watch her, their eyes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A young woman, alone, dressed in sorrow, was an anomaly here. She ignored their gazes, pulling her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the heat, and walked toward the livery stable. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with the scent of hay and liniment. An old gelding stood in the last stall, his coat the color of a dusty road, his head hanging low. "That'll be dust," the stable master said, not unkindly. "Your grandfather's horse. Board's paid for the month. After that, well." He let the sentence hang. Tessa walked to the stall. The horse lifted his heavy head, and his dark, liquid eyes met hers. There was a weariness in them she recognized in herself. She reached out a hand and stroked his velvety nose. He didn't flinch, just let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of resignation. He was her only family now, her silent companion. She paid the man for a saddle and bridle, her small purse feeling considerably lighter. That evening, in a small, stuffy room above the general store, she spread the map out on the lumpy bed. It was drawn with meticulous care, the elevation lines delicate as spider silk, but all the detail only served to emphasize the emptiness. In the center of a vast, featureless plain labeled Cinder Flats, there was a single hand-drawn square with an X through it. Beneath it, her grandfather's script read simply, "The Cell." No explanation, no legend, just a location. The weight of the unknown pressed down on her, as heavy and hot as the desert air. What had he built out there? And why had he locked it away? The next morning, Tessa went to the general store to purchase supplies. The place was a jumble of barrels, sacks, and hanging hardware, presided over by a man with a florid face and a superior smile. He introduced himself as Silas Croft, the owner of the store and, he made it clear, most everything else in Ghost Mesa worth owning. When Tessa laid out her meager list, a sack of flour, dried beans, a small side of bacon, 2 large canteens, he eyed her with open amusement. "Planning a long stay, missy?" he asked, his voice slick with condescension. Not much out here for a pretty thing like you." She met his gaze without flinching. "Just seeing something of my grandfather's." Croft laughed, a short, barking sound. "Elias Vance? The old mapmaker? Heard he left you his palace out in the flats." He leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial boom that carried through the entire store. "Let me give you some advice, free of charge. There's nothing out there but sun and snakes. He wasted the last 10 years of his life on that pile of rocks. Don't you go wasting your youth on it, too." She paid for her goods in silence, packed them into the saddlebags on Dust's back, and rode out of town without a backward glance. The mockery felt like a physical sting, but it also hardened something within her. It was the same tone the lawyer had used, the same dismissal her grandfather had likely faced his entire life. The trail leading out of Ghost Mesa quickly dissolved into a faint track in the sand, marked only by the skeletal remains of sun-bleached Ocotillo. The heat was a living thing, pressing down from a sky the color of faded denim. Hours passed. The landscape was brutally monolithic, red rock and pale sand, broken only by the shimmering waves of heat rising from the ground. Dust plodded onward with a steady, uncomplaining rhythm, his familiarity with the terrain her only comfort. Then she saw it. At first, it was just a dark speck on the horizon, a smudge against the vast, empty canvas of the desert. As she drew closer, it resolved into a shape. A low, square building of dark, almost black stone. It stood utterly alone, with no road leading to it, no fence, no other sign of human habitation for miles in any direction. It was as alien as if it had fallen from the sky. She reined Dust to a halt a few yards away. The silence was absolute. The structure was perhaps 10 feet high and 15 feet square, with no windows. The stones were fitted together with perfect precision. On the east-facing side was a single, heavy door made of thick, rust-pocked iron. In its center was a strange, star-shaped indentation, like a keyhole for a key that couldn't possibly exist. She dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft, cinder-like soil. She walked around the cell, running her hands over the stone. It was cool to the touch, impossibly cool in the blistering afternoon sun. She pushed on the door. It was immovable, solid, locked tight. A wave of profound disappointment washed over her. It was just what Croft had said. A pile of rocks, a folly, a tomb for a dead man's dream. What was she doing here? What had she expected to find? Had her grandfather truly lost his mind in this desolate place, leaving her nothing but a monument to his own madness? Let us know in the comments, would you have turned back right then? Or would you have stayed? Subscribe for more stories of forgotten history, because what Tessa chose to do next would uncover a secret that lay buried not in the ground, but in the very stone itself. Tessa returned to Ghost Mesa only when her water ran low, a journey she made with a heavy heart. The town felt different now. Before it had been indifferent. Now it was openly derisive. Her 2-day vigil at the stone cell had become local lore, a story told with chuckles in the saloon and knowing smirks over fence posts. As she filled her canteens at the public pump, she could hear the whispers. Vance's girl. Chasing a ghost, just like the old man. Silas Croft stood on the porch of his store, arms crossed, a smug grin plastered on his face. He caught her eye and tipped his hat in a gesture of mock respect. "Find your treasure yet, Miss Vance?" he called out, loud enough for half the town to hear. The men with him laughed. Tessa ignored him, her face a stoic mask, focusing on the rhythmic squeak of the pump handle. Each creak felt like a judgment. She was a fool, and this town was her jury. She had become the local curiosity, the punchline to a joke her own grandfather had written. Finished, she turned to lead dust away when a voice, quiet as the rustle of dry leaves, stopped her. The desert drinks at night. She turned to see an old woman sitting in the shade of a mesquite tree, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hands busy sorting a bundle of dried herbs. She was Teodora, a woman the townspeople mostly avoided, a curandera who lived on the edge of the settlement and spoke in riddles. Tessa had seen her before, but had never spoken to her. Teodora's dark eyes, ancient and knowing, fixed on Tessa. She wasn't looking at her with pity or scorn, but with a deep, unnerving appraisal. "Men think they can force this land," the old woman continued, her voice raspy. "They dig and they blast, but the desert only gives its water to those who know how to listen for the thirst of the stone." She held up a gnarled gray root. "This one sleeps for 10 years, waiting for a single rain. Patience is a deep root, child." The words made no sense. Thirst of the stone? It sounded like more madness, another layer of cryptic nonsense laid over her grandfather's inexplicable project. Tessa simply nodded, not knowing what to say. "Thank you," she murmured, though she wasn't sure what for. Teodora gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return and went back to her herbs. The brief audience concluded. The encounter left Tessa feeling more unsettled than Croft's open mockery. The merchant's laughter was simple cruelty, easily understood and dismissed. But the old woman's words felt like a key to a lock she couldn't see, a fragment of a map she didn't know how to read. They clung to her as she rode back out into the vast, silent emptiness of the cinder flats. Another piece of the puzzle she was beginning to fear had no solution at all. The sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. The stone cell waited for her on the horizon, a dark and silent question mark against the dying light. The old woman's phrase echoed in her mind. The thirst of the stone. Tessa made her decision under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the desert sky. She would not be driven away by the whispers of fools or the weight of her own doubt. This place, this strange, silent structure, was the last piece of her grandfather she had left. To leave it would be to leave him all over again. The next morning, she packed her bedroll, the last of her supplies, and the few precious items from her satchel, and left the rented room in Ghost Mesa for good. She rode back to the cell not as a visitor, but as a resident. She established a small, Spartan camp a few dozen yards from the stone walls, using a rocky outcrop as a windbreak. Her world shrank to the size of this single acre. Her days fell into a simple monastic rhythm dictated by the sun. She rose before dawn, when the air was cool and the light was a soft, pearly gray. She made a small fire, cooked her meager breakfast, and shared a portion of her water with Dust, who had become her steadfast, silent confidant. The first days were a trial of endurance. The silence was a physical pressure, broken only by the wind or the distant cry of a hawk. The loneliness was a constant ache. She would spend hours just watching the cell, as if expecting it to move or speak. She walked its perimeter again and again, her fingers tracing the impossibly fine seams between the stones. She sat with her back against its cool wall during the hottest part of the day, reading from her grandfather's book of poetry until the words blurred. The structure began to feel less like an object and more like a presence. It had moods. In the morning, it seemed to gather the cool air to itself. In the afternoon, it was a bastion against the oppressive heat. And in the evening, long after the sun had set and the surrounding sand had grown cold, the stones radiated a gentle, stored warmth. She would often fall asleep with her hand resting on the ground, feeling that faint heat seep up through the earth. She spoke to Dust constantly, her voice a low murmur in the immense quiet. "He must have had a reason, old friend," she'd say, stroking his neck as he munched on the dry grasses she gathered for him. "Men like him don't do things without a reason." The horse would flick an ear, his large, dark eye fixed on her, his presence a warm and reassuring weight against the crushing emptiness of the landscape. Sometimes, a memory of her grandfather would surface, sharp and clear. She remembered him sitting at his large drafting table, his face illuminated by a kerosene lamp, his hand moving with painstaking precision as he drew his maps. He had once told her, "A map isn't just a picture of a place, Tessa. It's a promise. It's a story of what's possible." She held on to that. This place, this cell, was the end of his last map. It had to be a promise of something. One evening, as a sliver of moon rose over the distant mountains, she felt a profound sense of despair wash over her. She was 19 years old, alone, with almost no money, camped beside a locked box in the middle of a wasteland. Her quest felt absurd, a child's fantasy. She buried her face in Dust's mane, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The horse stood perfectly still, absorbing her grief. When the tears subsided, she looked up at the cell, its dark form silhouetted against the star-strewn sky. It looked patient, unmovable. It had waited this long. It could wait a little longer, and so could she. A quiet resolve settled in her heart. She would not be broken by this place. She would learn its language. A week bled into 2. The desert, which had at first seemed static and dead, began to reveal its subtle life. Tessa learned the paths of the lizards, the habits of the night-flying moths, the exact moment the evening primrose would unfold its pale, luminous petals. And as she watched the world around her, she began to notice things about the cell, small details that refused to fit the narrative of a simple, solid box. The stone, she realized, was not uniform. Her grandfather had used a variety of different rocks in its construction. Some were dark and volcanic, smooth as river stones. Others were lighter, a porous, sandy-colored rock that seemed almost like a sponge. They were arranged in a deliberate pattern, a mosaic of texture and color that was most visible in the low, raking light of dawn and dusk. One morning, tracing the wall with her hand, she felt it, a network of tiny, almost invisible grooves etched into the surface. They weren't cracks or flaws. They were deliberate, forming a delicate, web-like pattern that covered the entire structure. They all seemed to slope gently downward, channeling something toward the base of the walls. That evening, a rare bank of clouds rolled in from the east, and a light mist, too fine to be called rain, began to fall. Tessa watched, fascinated as the porous stones seemed to darken, drinking in the moisture. The fine film of dew that coated the smooth stones was caught by the tiny grooves and guided, drop by precious drop, down the walls to the ground. She knelt and saw where the water was going, into a shallow, sand-filled trough that circled the entire base of the cell, which she had previously dismissed as a simple foundation. The structure was designed to weep. It was a harvester of dew. Then there was the sound. On still nights, when the wind died down completely, she could hear it. A faint, low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from within the stone itself. It was a deep, resonant thrumming, like a sleeping giant's breath. It would begin just after midnight and cease precisely at sunrise. At first, she thought she was imagining it, her mind playing tricks in the profound silence. But Dust heard it too. The old horse would often stand near the cell in the dead of night, his ears pricked, his head cocked as if listening to a conversation she could not comprehend. And it was Dust who gave her the final, most important clue. The horse had a habit of nudging her hand for attention, a gentle but insistent push with his nose. One afternoon, he did the same to the iron door of the cell. He nudged it once, twice, then rested his nose directly on the star-shaped indentation in the center. He huffed a soft puff of air and looked back at her, his eyes seeming to hold a question. He nudged the spot again. It wasn't random. He was showing her something. She had assumed it was a keyhole, a place for a key she did not have. But looking at it now, prompted by her silent companion, she saw it differently. It wasn't a hole. The star was solid metal set into the plate of the door, and around its edge, she saw tiny, almost worn-away markings, like the numbers on a compass rose. It wasn't a lock. It was a dial. The discovery that the star was a dial, not a keyhole, electrified Tessa. It shifted everything. Her grandfather hadn't left her locked out. He had left her a puzzle, a mechanism. She raced to her saddlebags and rummaged through the small canvas roll of tools her grandfather had always carried with him. It held a hammer, some files, a few odd-shaped bits of metal, and at the very bottom, wrapped in an oilcloth, a heavy, star-shaped wrench. She had never known its purpose. It was a perfect match for the dial on the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The key. With trembling hands, she fitted the wrench onto the dial. It slid into place with a satisfying click. She took a deep breath and pulled. Nothing. It was frozen solid, seized by years of rust and fine blowing sand that had worked its way into every crevice. She pulled again, straining with all her might, but the dial wouldn't budge. Disappointment was a bitter taste in her mouth, but it was quickly replaced by a familiar, stubborn resolve. It was a machine, and machines could be fixed. This became her new labor. For days, she worked on the mechanism. She used the last of the oil from her lantern, dripping it carefully into the seam around the dial, letting it seep into the works. She used a small file to painstakingly clean the sand and rust from every groove she could reach. It was slow, frustrating work. The sun beat down on her back. Her knuckles were scraped raw, but the physical labor focused her, connecting her to the structure in a new way. As she worked, she felt a kinship with the man who had built it. She could almost feel his hands on the stone, his mind calculating the angles, his patient effort in the face of this vast, indifferent landscape. She was no longer just a visitor or a guardian. She was a participant in his work. She cleared the sand and debris from the shallow trough at the base of the cell, uncovering the full extent of the channel system. The grooves in the wall fed directly into it, and the trough itself was lined with smooth, sealed stone, sloping toward a single point on the north side of the structure. The whole building was an ingenious passive water collector, designed to harvest every last drop of atmospheric moisture. Her grandfather hadn't just built a box. He had built a machine that drank the air, Her hands learned the truth before her mind fully grasped it. They learned the texture of the porous stone versus the smooth, the logic of the grooves, the patient mechanics of the rusted dial. She was in a dialogue with the cell, a conversation conducted through labor and observation. Finally, after a week of patient work, she felt a slight give. She applied steady pressure with the wrench, and with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth, the dial turned. It moved only an inch, but it was enough. It was a response. The cell had answered her. The sound wasn't one of unlocking, though. It was a lower, grinding noise, the sound of stone on stone coming from somewhere beneath her feet. With a surge of adrenaline, Tessa put her shoulder into the wrench and turned it again. The grinding sound grew louder, and then a section of the stone trough on the north side of the cell slid away, revealing a dark opening. She peered inside. A set of steep stone steps led down into the cool darkness. The air that rose up smelled of damp earth and clean water. She lit her lantern and descended. The steps led to a small, circular chamber, a cistern carved directly out of the bedrock. It was filled with several feet of crystal-clear, cold water. The intricate system of grooves and troughs on the cell's exterior all fed into this hidden reservoir. Her grandfather had solved the desert's most fundamental problem. He had made water from air and stone. Overwhelmed, she sat on the stone steps, the lantern light dancing on the water's surface. He hadn't been mad. He had been a genius. She climbed back into the sunlight. Her mind reeling, she looked at the dial. It had more to give. She fitted the wrench again and turned it in the opposite direction. This time, a series of clicks came from the iron door itself. A small, square panel, no bigger than a book, slid open with a soft, metallic sigh. It wasn't the whole door, just a compartment set within it. Her hands shaking, she reached inside. Her fingers closed around a rectangular tin box, heavy for its size. She lifted it out and carried it to the shade of her camp. With the tip of a file, she pried open the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small leather-bound journal, a wax-sealed packet of seeds, and a single, beautifully crafted brass key. The key was for the main door. She opened the journal. The first page was in her grandfather's familiar, precise script. "My dearest Tessa," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have been patient. You have listened. You have understood. This is not a fortress or a tomb. It is a beginning. I call it a life cell." He went on to explain everything: the porous, hygroscopic stone that absorbed moisture from the night air, the internal baffles that encouraged condensation, the cistern, the purpose. It was a self-sustaining nursery, an ark for life in the most lifeless of places. The final entry was dated just a month before his death. "The system is stable, the cistern is filling, but the door must not be opened until after the first true rain, to ensure the internal humidity is balanced for the planting. The key is for you. The seeds are for the future. You are the gardener now." Tears streamed down Tessa's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, aching pride. She held the packet of seeds up to the light. On it, in her grandfather's hand, was one word: marigolds. As Tessa sat absorbing the contents of the journal, a change was coming over the sky. The brilliant, cloudless blue had deepened to a bruised, unsettling shade of yellow-gray on the western horizon. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, picked up suddenly, carrying a gritty taste of dust. Dust, the horse, grew agitated, stamping his feet and snorting, his eyes wide and fixed on the approaching wall of darkness. Tessa had heard stories in town of the great dust storms, the haboobs that could rise up without warning, scouring the landscape and choking all life. She had never seen one. The wall of sand and dirt was immense, a churning, tumbling monster that blotted out the sun and seemed to swallow the sky. It was moving impossibly fast. Panic seized her for a moment. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Then she saw it, a faint trail of dust in the distance, moving desperately ahead of the storm. It was a wagon, pulled by a single flagging horse. She could hear the faint shouts of a man, the cry of a child. They were losing the race. Her grandfather's words from the journal echoed in her mind. A beginning. An arc for life. The cell wasn't just for plants. She grabbed the brass key from the tin box. The journal had said to wait for rain, but this was a different kind of trial. She ran to the iron door and thrust the key into the main lock, a simple, traditional lock below the star dial. The key turned smoothly. With a great heave, she pulled the heavy iron door outward. It swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing the interior. The air that flowed out was cool and damp, smelling of rich earth and stone. The inside was a single stone-flagged room. In the center was a rectangular plot of dark, moist soil, about 6 feet by 10. The walls were lined with intricate, fin-like structures of the same porous stone, the baffles her grandfather had described. It was a sanctuary. "This way!" she screamed into the rising wind, waving her arms. The driver of the wagon saw her and veered toward the cell. The wagon, a simple farm buckboard, skidded to a halt, the horse heaving, its sides lathered in sweat and foam. A man, his face pale with fear, leapt down, followed by a woman clutching a small child. "What is this place?" he yelled over the roar of the wind. "Sanctuary!" Tessa shouted back. "Get inside!" They scrambled toward the open door as the first wave of the storm hit, a blast of sand and wind that felt like a physical blow. Tessa guided their exhausted horse to the lee side of the cell, giving it what shelter she could, before she followed the family inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The world outside vanished into a screaming, chaotic roar. But inside the cell, there was a sudden, profound silence. The only sound was their own ragged breathing. The small child, a girl of about 5, began to cry, terrified by the darkness. Tessa, her hands steady now, lit her lantern. The soft, golden light filled the small space, revealing the frightened faces of the family. "Marta, it's all right," Tessa said, her voice calm and even. "We're safe in here." She showed them the cistern, drawing cool, clean water for them to drink. The man, whose name was Potter, looked at her, then at the thick stone walls, his expression one of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. They huddled together, listening to the fury of the storm as it raged outside, a tempest held at bay by her grandfather's patient genius. In that moment, Tessa understood the true nature of her inheritance. It was not a treasure to be hoarded, but a gift to be shared. It was a shelter. The storm raged for 2 hours. When the wind finally died down and the roar subsided, Mr. Potter pushed open the heavy iron door. The world outside was transformed. A thick blanket of reddish-brown dust covered everything, softening the sharp edges of the landscape. The air was hazy, but the sun was breaking through, casting long, ethereal rays through the dust-filled atmosphere. The Potter family emerged from the cell, blinking in the strange light, looking at Tessa with expressions of awe. "You saved us," Mrs. Potter said, her voice thick with emotion. "We would have been lost out there. That horse of ours went lame just as the storm hit." Mr. Potter gripped Tessa's hand. "We owe you our lives, miss. My name is John Potter. This is my wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Lily." He looked around at the cell, then back at Tessa. "What is this place?" Tessa smiled, a true, warm smile. "It was my grandfather's," she said simply. "He built it." After ensuring their horse was watered and tended to, the Potters made their slow way back to Ghost Mesa, promising to send help for their broken wagon. When they arrived in town, Their story spread like wildfire. It was not a tale of a fool's errand, but of a miraculous rescue. They described the strange stone building that had appeared out of the dust, the cool, quiet interior, the clean water, and the young woman who had given them shelter. The townspeople were stunned into silence. The whispers of mockery were replaced by murmurs of wonder. Silas Croft heard the story from Potter himself and was, for the first time in anyone's memory, speechless. The laughter had died in his throat. A few days later, Ben, the freighter who had known Tessa's grandfather, made a special trip out to the cell. He brought fresh supplies and a letter from the Potters, filled with gratitude. He looked at the cell, then at Tessa, his weathered face breaking into a proud grin. Elias always said he was building something important, Ben said, his voice gruff with emotion. He wasn't wrong. He'd be so proud of you, Tessa. The tide had turned. People from Ghost Mesa began to ride out, not to gawk, but to see. They would stand at a respectful distance, looking at the stone structure that had saved a family. They saw it now not as a folly, but as a wonder. The vindication was quiet but profound. The ultimate confirmation came a week later, in the form of a traveling geologist from a Boston university who had been in the territory surveying for a new rail line. He heard the Potters' story in a neighboring town and, his curiosity piqued, hired a guide to take him to the Cinder Flats. He was a tall, methodical man with spectacles and an air of academic authority. He spent an entire day at the cell, examining the stone, tapping the walls, studying the journal Tessa showed him. He took samples of the different rocks and tasted the water from the cistern. As the sun began to set, he turned to Tessa, his face alight with intellectual excitement. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice hushed with reverence, "do you have any idea what your grandfather accomplished here? This is revolutionary. He's created a passive atmospheric water condenser using principles of thermal mass and hygroscopic geology that academics are only just beginning to theorize about. This isn't just a building, it's a blueprint for survival. This could change everything out here." Croft, who had ridden out with the geologist, hoping to debunk the story, stood by, his face a mask of humbled astonishment. The land he had dismissed as worthless held a secret worth more than any gold he could ever dig from it. The sun was a fiery globe on the horizon, bathing the Cinder Flats in a warm, golden light. The dust from the storm had settled, and the recent moisture had coaxed a faint blush of green from the desert floor. The visitors were gone. The geologist had returned to the east, promising to publish a paper on Elias Vance's remarkable invention. The townspeople had returned to their lives, their perception of the Vance legacy forever altered. It was quiet again at the cell, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the silence of peace. Tessa stood at the open door of the cell, with Dust standing patiently behind her, his warm breath on her shoulder. The air inside was cool and smelled of life, of damp soil waiting. She had spent the last few days preparing the plot of earth in the center of the room, turning it with a small spade from her grandfather's tool roll, feeling its rich, dark texture. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the small, wax-sealed packet of seeds. Her grandfather's handwriting was steady and clear. Marigolds. A simple flower. Not corn, not beans. A flower. She remembered asking him once why he loved them so much. He had smiled. "Because they're stubborn," he'd said. "They're bright and tough, and they bring color to forgotten places." Now she understood. He wasn't just trying to see if something could grow. He was making a statement. That life and beauty could take root in the harshest of lands. She broke the wax seal and poured the tiny dark seeds into her palm. She knelt on the stone floor, her knees cool against the flags, and let her fingers sink into the waiting earth. One by one, she pressed the seeds into the soil. She was not just planting flowers, she was planting a promise. She was completing the last sentence of her grandfather's story. When she was finished, she stood up and looked out at the vast, beautiful, and now promising landscape. The sky was shifting from gold to a deep, velvety violet. She thought of the mockery, the doubt, the loneliness, and the quiet, miraculous vindication. She looked back at the small plot of earth, a patch of hope in a house of stone. She finally understood the full scope of his vision, the love and patience that had built this place. In a quiet murmur, to herself and to the spirit of the man who had left her this legacy, she said the words that held the entire truth of it. "He wasn't building a prison," she whispered. "He was building a garden. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet inheritance and the profound strength found in patient stewardship." If Tessa's journey moved you, please consider liking this video and leaving a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and the remarkable people who write it. We'll be back soon with the story of a forgotten lighthouse and the secret it kept for 100 years. Until then, take care.